My name is Claire. I'm 41 years old. And for most of my life, I believed I was doing everything right. I was the responsible one, the calm one, the woman who made good choices. At least that's what people said. What they didn't see was how slowly I disappeared while trying to live up to that image. I've never told this story out loud. Not because it's dramatic. Not because it's shocking. But because it's honest in a way that still scares me. I grew up learning how to be needed. My mother was overwhelmed, my father emotionally distant. I became the quiet helper early on. The child who didn't ask for much, who didn't cause problems, who learned that love often came with conditions. If I was useful, I was valued. If I was calm, I was praised. If I asked for more, I was too much. So I learned to ask for less. By the time I reached my 30s, this pattern felt normal. I chose stability over excitement. Predictability over desire. Safety over truth. When I met my husband, Mark, everyone said he was perfect for me. He was kind. Reliable. Emotionally steady. He never raised his voice. Never played games. Never made me feel insecure. And yet, something inside me stayed quiet in a way I couldn't explain. Not unhappy, just muted. We married when I was 33. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting my dress, telling myself, this is what happiness looks like. I believed it, or at least I needed to. Marriage settled into something comfortable very quickly. We had routines. Shared calendars. Dinner at the same time every night. We talked about practical things, bills, groceries, work schedules. We were efficient partners. But intimacy became something scheduled. Predictable. Almost polite. I told myself this was normal. That passion fades. That stability is more important than intensity. And for a long time that logic worked. Until it didn't. The change didn't come as a storm, it came quietly. It started the year I turned 39. I had just returned to work after a short break. New team. New environment. And for the first time in years, someone looked at me like they were actually seeing me. His name was Ethan. He wasn't charming in a dramatic way. He wasn't particularly bold or flirtatious. He was attentive. He asked questions, real ones. Not how was your weekend? But what made you choose this career? Not are you busy? But do you enjoy the life you've built? First I laughed those questions off. I told myself he was just curious. That I was overthinking it. But something inside me stirred every time he spoke. Felt like being remembered by myself. We didn't talk about feelings, we didn't cross lines. At least not physically. But our conversations grew longer. Deeper. More personal. I found myself thinking about what I would say to him before meetings. Replaying our conversations afterward. I noticed how alive I felt. And how alarming that realization was. Because nothing had actually changed. My husband was still kind. Still present. Still loving in his own steady way. And yet I felt more alone at home than I ever had. That contradiction became unbearable. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That attraction is normal. That it doesn't mean anything unless you act on it. I promised myself I wouldn't. But I also didn't stop. I didn't set boundaries, I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into the feeling quietly, carefully. Like touching something warm and convincing myself it wouldn't burn. I told myself it was harmless because no one knew. But that was the first lie. At night, lying next to my husband, I would stare at the ceiling and ask myself questions I had avoided for years. Was I truly happy? Had I chosen this life, or simply accepted it? Was loyalty the same as honesty? The answers frightened me. So I buried them. I focused on being the woman everyone expected me to be. The dependable wife. The mature adult. The one who didn't cause damage. I didn't realize that silence can be a form of damage too. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. That year wasn't about another man. It was about the moment I realized I had been emotionally starving, and didn't know how to ask for nourishment without destroying everything I had built. I didn't want to leave, I didn't want to cheat, I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to feel awake again. And that desire would soon force me to face choices I wasn't prepared to make. But at the time, I still believed I could keep everything exactly as it was. There is a particular kind of guilt that doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't scream, it doesn't accuse. It settles in quietly, like dust, until one day you realize it's everywhere. That's what happened to me. After I acknowledged, even silently, that something was missing in my life, I became hyper-aware of everything that wasn't being said. At home, my marriage continued as it always had. Mark would ask about my day, and I would give him a version of it. Not a lie exactly, just a carefully edited truth. He talked about work, about plans, about the future in practical terms. And I nodded, I agreed, I participated. But my mind often drifted elsewhere. Not to Ethan specifically, at least not at first. To the feeling. That sense of being emotionally alert, of being curious again, of wanting to be understood, not just accommodated. At work, the boundaries blurred slowly. Nothing inappropriate happened, no lingering touches, no secret meetings. But the emotional closeness grew in ways that felt harder to define, and therefore easier to justify. Ethan noticed details. When I was quieter than usual. When I was tired but pretending not to be. When my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. "You seem like someone who carries a lot," he said once casually, while we were reviewing a project. The comment stayed with me longer than it should have. 'Cause he was right. And because no one had ever named that part of me out loud before. I started sharing things I didn't even realize I had been holding back. Not dramatic confessions. Just truths. That I sometimes felt invisible. That I struggled with the feeling that my life had been decided before I truly understood myself. That being content felt suspiciously close to being numb. He listened. Not to respond. Not to fix. Just to understand. That kind of attention is dangerous when you've been deprived of it. I didn't see it as a threat at the time. I saw it as relief. Home, I tried to compensate. I cooked more. Initiated conversations. Suggested date nights. I told myself I was restoring balance. Giving my marriage what it deserved. But something felt off. The more I tried to reconnect with my husband, the more I realized how far apart we already were. We weren't fighting, we weren't unhappy. We were simply parallel. Two people moving in the same direction but no longer truly touching. That realization hurt more than anger ever could have. I began to ask myself uncomfortable questions. Was loyalty enough if it required silence? Was stability worth the slow erosion of my inner life? Was it possible to be faithful and still dishonest? I didn't like the answers that surfaced. So I distracted myself. With work. With routine. With the illusion of control. I told myself I could manage this. That as long as I didn't cross a physical line, everything was still intact. But emotional lines are harder to see. And even harder to undo. One evening, after everyone had left the office, Ethan and I stayed behind to finish something urgent. The building was quiet. Too quiet. At some point, the conversation drifted. Away from work, away from safe topics. He asked me if I was happy. Not in a casual way. Not rhetorically. He waited for an answer. I remember feeling my throat tighten. Because the truth sat right there. Heavy, ready. And I didn't know what would happen if I released it. So I gave him something in between. "I'm stable," I said. He didn't smile. "That's not what I asked," he replied gently. The moment stretched. I could have laughed it off, changed the subject. Put the walls back up. Instead I stayed quiet. And in that silence, something shifted. After that night, everything felt different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just charged. Our conversations became more careful and more loaded. We avoided certain topics, which only made them more present. Became aware of myself in new ways. The way I dressed. The way I spoke. The way I anticipated his reactions. I hated that. Because it meant I was already farther down this path than I wanted to admit. At home, guilt began to seep into the smallest moments. I felt it while folding laundry, while brushing my teeth, while listening to my husband talk about his day. I wasn't doing anything wrong, and yet I felt dishonest. The contradiction was exhausting. I wanted to confess something, anything just to relieve the pressure. But what would I even say? I'm not unhappy, but I'm not fulfilled. I'm loyal, but my heart feels divided. I love you, but I don't feel seen. Those aren't sentences you can say without consequences. And I wasn't ready for consequences. I told myself this phase would pass. That curiosity fades. That emotional intensity settles. That I would return to normal. But deep down, I knew something irreversible had already happened. I had allowed myself to imagine a version of life where I was fully awake. And once you've seen that version of yourself, it's impossible to forget her. By the end of that year, I wasn't standing at the edge anymore. I was already in the middle, balancing carefully, telling myself I could still step back. Still convincing myself that no one was getting hurt. I didn't yet understand that avoidance is a decision too. And that the longer you delay the truth, the more painful it becomes when it finally demands to be seen. There's a difference between knowing something is happening and admitting that you're participating in it. For a long time I stayed in that space between the two. I told myself I was simply responding. Listening. Being human. I didn't see myself as someone who made active decisions. That illusion didn't last. After that evening in the office, when Ethan asked if I was happy and refused to accept a safe answer, a subtle distance formed between us. Not separation. Awareness. We both understood that something had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't been named. And once something is acknowledged, pretending it doesn't exist takes effort. Became more cautious. I told myself this was responsibility. I shortened conversations. Avoided certain topics. Made excuses to leave early. But the restraint only intensified everything underneath. Every glance felt heavier. Every pause more intentional. I began to understand something uncomfortable. Avoidance doesn't remove desire. It sharpens it. Home, Mark noticed the shift. Not immediately. He's not an inattentive man. Just someone who assumes stability unless proven otherwise. He asked if I was tired, that if work was stressful, if something was bothering me. I answered honestly, and incompletely. Yes, I said, but never explained why. One night we sat on opposite ends of the couch, watching something neither of us was really paying attention to. He reached for my hand. The gesture was familiar, automatic, and I felt a sudden wave of grief. Not because I didn't love him, but because I realized how long it had been since that touch made me feel chosen, rather than expected. I squeezed his hand back and smiled. Then I excused myself early and went to bed alone. The next day at work, Ethan and I were assigned to collaborate closely on a project. There was no way around it. Meetings. Long hours. Shared responsibility. I considered asking to be reassigned. I didn't. I told myself that avoidance would only make things awkward. That professionalism would keep everything in check. That was another lie. Working together stripped away the distance I had tried to create. We talked more. Not emotionally, intentionally avoiding that, but the proximity alone did something. I became aware of his habits. The way he focused when thinking. The way he paused before responding. the quiet respect in how he treated people. None of it was extraordinary. That's what made it dangerous. One afternoon, while reviewing something trivial, he said quietly, "You don't have to carry everything alone." The sentence wasn't dramatic. He didn't look at me when he said it. But it landed with precision. I felt my chest tighten. Because he was naming something I had built my identity around. Being capable, composed, self-sufficient. Being the woman who didn't need too much. I didn't respond. But that night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying moments from my marriage, my childhood, my entire adult life. How often I had chosen to be agreeable instead of honest. How often I had mistaken peace for fulfillment. How easily I disappeared when no one asked me to stay visible. The next boundary broke in a way that felt almost accidental. We were leaving the building late, walking to the parking lot. The air was cool. The lot mostly empty. He asked if I wanted to sit for a minute. Just to decompress. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what the hesitation meant. Still I agreed. We sat in his car. The engine off. The silence heavy but not uncomfortable. We didn't talk at first. Then he said, "I don't want to be something that complicates your life." The sentence was careful, respectful, and completely useless, because the complication already existed. I told him I wasn't planning to change my life. I told him I wasn't looking for an escape. I told him I valued my marriage. All of that was true. What I didn't say was how starved I felt. How alive I was in that moment. How terrifying it was to realize those things at the same time. He listened. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I don't want to cross a line you'll hate yourself for later." That should have ended it. Instead, it made me feel safe enough to step closer.
The first touch wasn't deliberate. My hand brushed his. Neither of us moved away. Time slowed, not in a cinematic way, but in a deeply physical one. I was aware of every sensation, every breath, every thought screaming at me to stop, and another, quieter one asking why I always did. I pulled back first, not because I wanted to, because I was afraid of who I would become if I didn't. I said we should go. He didn't argue. That restraint felt intimate in its own way. Driving home, I felt split in two. Part of me was horrified. Another part was grieving the moment ending. That contradiction stayed with me all night. And the next day. And the next. The truth is, something fundamental had already shifted. I hadn't kissed him. I hadn't confessed feelings. But I had allowed myself to imagine a life where my inner world mattered. And once you allow that, returning to silence feels unbearable. I wish I could say I chose clarity after that. I didn't. I chose delay. I chose balance. I chose to believe I could carry this quietly, without breaking anything. I didn't yet understand that quiet doesn't mean harmless. It just means the damage takes longer to surface. By the time I realized how deeply entangled I was, the question was no longer if something would change. It was what would be lost when it did. Living with something unspoken changes the texture of your days. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply occupies space, quietly, constantly, until everything else feels crowded. That's how my life began to feel. After that night in the parking lot, nothing officially changed. And yet, everything did. Ethan and I never spoke about what almost happened. There was an unspoken agreement to return to professionalism, to restraint, to safety. But restraint requires energy. And I was running out of it. At work, we became careful in a way that felt unnatural. We limited conversations, avoided being alone together, chose emails over face-to-face discussions. The avoidance was noticeable, not because it was obvious, but because it was intentional. I became hyper-aware of how it might look from the outside. Every glance felt risky, every laugh too loud, every moment of silence suspicious. I lived in a state of low-level panic, constantly scanning for signs that someone had noticed. At home, Mark sensed the distance more clearly now. He tried to bridge it. He planned a weekend away, suggested therapy, casually, gently, asked if I still wanted the life we were building. The question felt like a verdict. I said yes, not because I was certain, because I was afraid of what saying no would mean. The guilt began to reshape me. I became sharper, more impatient. Small things irritated me, not because of what they were, but because I was exhausted from managing myself. I hated that I was becoming someone unfamiliar in my own home. Sleep stopped coming easily. My mind replayed conversations on a loop. What I'd said, what I hadn't said, what might happen if the truth surfaced. I imagined every possible outcome. None of them clean, none of them painless. Ethan noticed the strain. One afternoon, after weeks of careful distance, he asked if I was okay. Not in a way that invited a safe answer. In a way that made avoidance feel cruel. I told him I was tired. He nodded. I don't want to be the reason you're hurting, he said. I believed him. And I hated that believing him didn't make things easier. The first real consequence arrived quietly. A coworker asked if everything was okay between us. Casually, almost jokingly. I laughed it off. But the question followed me home like a shadow. It meant we weren't invisible anymore. That night, Mark asked if there was someone else. Not accusing. Uncertain. Vulnerable. I felt something in me collapse. I denied it. Not defensively. Convincingly. I watched relief wash over his face, and realized what I had just taken from him. After that, the lie became heavier than the truth ever would have been. I started to resent the weight of it, not because I was trapped, but because I was choosing to stay trapped. Ethan pulled back. Not dramatically. Just enough. Less availability, shorter conversations, more distance. It was the responsible thing to do. It also felt like abandonment. I hated myself for that thought. One evening, he told me he was considering leaving. Not because of me, he said. Because staying felt dishonest. Because he couldn't continue pretending nothing was happening. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had assumed I was the one at risk of losing everything. I hadn't considered that he was losing something too. For the first time, I felt truly alone. Not in my marriage. Not at work. Inside myself. I had no version of a story where I could be fully honest without destroying someone. And I had no version where silence didn't continue to erode me. I began to understand something fundamental. There is no neutral position when you're living in avoidance. Every day you don't choose, you still choose. And the cost accumulates quietly. One night, I stood in the bathroom staring at my reflection. I barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked composed, functional, and profoundly disconnected. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. When did being good start costing me my sense of self? I didn't have an answer, but I knew this couldn't continue. Something had to give. I just didn't yet know whether that something would be my marriage, my sense of integrity, or the version of myself I had worked so hard to maintain. The breaking point didn't come with an argument. It didn't come with a discovery. It came with exhaustion. The kind that strips away illusion and leaves only truth behind. By the end of that week, I understood something clearly for the first time. I wasn't afraid of losing my life as it was. I was afraid of finally admitting that it no longer fit. The truth doesn't always arrive as a confession. Sometimes it arrives as a moment when you realize you can no longer keep pretending, not without losing something essential. That moment came for me on an ordinary evening. Mark and I were sitting at the kitchen table. Nothing was wrong on the surface. Dinner finished, plates pushed aside, the familiar quiet between us. He was talking about something small, a plan for the weekend, a task that needed to be done. And suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to stop him. Not because of what he was saying, but because I knew I couldn't keep nodding along while my inner life moved in a completely different direction. I asked him if he was happy. The question surprised us both. He paused, thought for a moment, and said, "I think so." Then he looked at me. "And you?" That was it. No accusation, and oh pressure. Just a door opening. I didn't tell him about Ethan. Not yet. I told him something more dangerous. I told him I felt lost. I told him that I'd been quiet for too long, that I didn't feel fully present in my own life, that I didn't know how to say it without hurting him. My voice shook. But I didn't stop. He listened. Truly listened. And when I finished, he said something I wasn't prepared for. "I wish you had told me earlier." Not angrily. Not bitterly. Just honestly. That sentence broke something open inside me. Because it wasn't blame. It was grief. Grief for time, for missed chances, for conversations we never had. We talked for hours that night. Not about solutions. Not about decisions. About who we had been, and who we were now. We acknowledged things we'd both ignored. The distance, the routine, the unspoken assumption that stability was enough. The next day, I met Ethan. I asked him to talk. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere final. I told him the truth. That I couldn't continue living in between. That the connection mattered, but not at the cost of my integrity. That I needed to choose honesty, even if it meant loss. He didn't argue. That hurt more than resistance would have. He said he respected my choice. That he never wanted to be a secret. That he hoped I would choose myself, whatever that meant. When we said goodbye, it felt like mourning something that never fully existed. A life imagined, a version of myself briefly visible. Letting go of that was painful. But it was also clarifying. At home, Mark and I didn't magically fix anything. Honesty doesn't work like that. But something shifted. We began speaking differently. More carefully, more truthfully. We acknowledged that love doesn't erase neglect, and that good intentions don't replace presence. Weeks passed. Then months. We went to therapy. We tried to rebuild something that felt real, not just functional. Some days it worked. Some days it didn't. In the end, we made a decision. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. We chose to separate. Not because of betrayal, but because we finally admitted we had grown into different people, and staying would mean shrinking again. The separation wasn't easy, but it was honest. And honesty, I learned, doesn't always feel good. It feels clean. I live alone now. Not lonely, just present. I'm learning how to ask for what I need without apologizing. How to take up space. How to stay awake in my own life. I don't regret choosing truth. I regret how long it took me to speak it. This isn't a story about another man. It's a story about a woman who mistook silence for virtue and learned too late that disappearing is not the same as being faithful. My name is Claire. I'm 41 years old, and this was my confession.